The night was supposed to be just another job, a quick snatch and go. The fugitives had planned everything down to the last detail: grab the woman, secure the ransom, and disappear before anyone even knew she was missing. She looked like an easy target alone, unassuming, just another face in the crowd. They had no idea they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. Because the woman they stuffed into the back of their van wasn't just anybody. She was a force of nature, a decorated leader of an elite Delta Force unit. A soldier trained to survive against impossible odds, to dismantle threats from the inside, and to take down enemies before they even knew they were in danger. And now, trapped in a moving vehicle with armed criminals, she wasn't scared, she was calculating. As the van sped down a deserted highway, the kidnappers laughed, already counting the money they thought was coming. They had no idea that the real fight hadn't even begun. A shift in her posture, a flicker of movement, just enough to test their awareness. They were sloppy, overconfident. And that was all she needed. Because soon, they wouldn't be asking where to collect the ransom. They'd be begging to survive. The van rattled along the darkened highway, its worn-out tires humming against the pavement. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sweat, cigarette smoke, and the stale stench of beer. The kidnappers sat in the front seats, their laughter filling the space as they joked about their latest job. They thought they had everything under control. They were dead wrong. In the back, hands bound and head bowed, the woman sat still, her breathing slow and measured. The ropes around her wrists were tight, but not unbreakable. Her heartbeat remained steady, her mind assessing every detail: the weight of the van, the positioning of the men, the placement of weapons. She had been in far worse situations before, under enemy fire in foreign lands, outnumbered and outgunned. This was nothing but an opportunity. One of the men, a wiry guy with a nervous energy, turned in his seat to look at her. "You're awfully quiet back there," he said, grinning. "Most people beg by now." "You scared, lady?" She lifted her gaze just enough to meet his eyes, but said nothing. Her silence unnerved him. The other guy, a beefy man with a scar across his cheek, chuckled. "Nah, she's just trying to act tough. Doesn't matter. Once we get the money, she's not our problem." Money. That was their game. They thought she was just some wealthy woman, some easy target. That meant they hadn't researched her. They had no idea who she was. That gave her an advantage. The van took a sharp turn, the tires skidding slightly on loose gravel. They were moving off the highway now, heading toward isolation. That was fine. Fewer witnesses meant fewer obstacles when it was time to strike. The nervous one, he seemed to be the weakest link. His grip on his gun was uncertain, his body language betraying inexperience. The scarred one, however, was different. More confident. More dangerous. She needed to take them both out fast, but first she had to wait for the perfect moment. They reached a remote cabin deep in the woods, hidden away from prying eyes. The engine cut off, leaving only the sound of chirping crickets and rustling leaves. The men climbed out, yanking her along roughly. She allowed them to pull her to her feet, feigning more struggle than necessary. They needed to believe she was helpless. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. A single bulb swung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows. A third man sat at the table, counting a stack of bills. He was older, with graying hair and cold, calculating eyes. The leader, Diva. "Good," he muttered, not even looking at her. "Get her locked up. We'll make the call in the morning." The scarred man nodded and dragged her toward a small, windowless room at the back. The nervous one followed, still gripping his weapon too tight. Good. She took a shaky step forward, pretending to stumble. The nervous guy reached out instinctively to steady her. That was his mistake. In a blur, she moved, pivoting her body, twisting her bound wrists just enough to slip them over his arm. His eyes widened, but before he could react, she yanked hard, using his own weight against him. He hit the ground with a choked gasp. The scarred man spun around, but she was already in motion. She launched herself at him, striking his throat with the force of a sledgehammer. He staggered, gasping for air. No hesitation. She wrenched the gun from his grip, flipped it around, and pressed the barrel against his temple. The room fell into silence. The nervous guy whimpered, clutching his wrist where she had twisted it too far. The scarred man glared at her, but she could see the fear in his eyes now. She leaned in, her voice calm. "You have no idea who you took, do you?" The scarred man swallowed hard but said nothing. She took a step back, assessing the situation. She had the gun, but there was still one more man outside. The leader, Diva. He would hear the struggle soon. She needed to act fast. Keeping the gun trained on the two men, she reached into the scarred man's jacket, pulling out a second weapon. Fully loaded. Perfect. Then she heard the creak of the cabin floorboards. The leader was coming. She had seconds. Her grip tightened on the trigger, her pulse steady. They had taken the wrong woman. And now, they were going to find out exactly what that meant. The footsteps grew louder, slow and deliberate. The leader was no fool, he knew something was wrong. A moment of silence hung in the air before he spoke, his voice calm but laced with suspicion. "What's going on back there?" She didn't answer. Instead, she took a step toward the door, her newly acquired gun gripped firmly in her hands. The scarred man and the nervous one remained frozen, their backs pressed against the wall. They had finally realized the truth, they were no longer in control. Another step. The floor creaked beneath her boot, the only sound in the suffocating quiet. Then, the leader moved. A sharp, metallic click echoed in the air. A gun being cocked. She barely had time to react before the first shot rang out. She dropped low, rolling across the floor as the bullet slammed into the wooden wall behind her. Splinters rained down, but she didn't stop moving. Her training kicked in, predict the angles, anticipate the next move. The leader wasn't firing blindly. He was methodical, aiming to corner her rather than waste bullets. Smart. But not smart enough. She raised her own weapon and fired twice. The first shot shattered the light bulb hanging from the ceiling, plunging the cabin into darkness. The second hit the doorframe, close enough to force him to back off. Silence. Her heartbeat was steady, her breathing controlled. Her eyes adjusted quickly, scanning for movement. The leader was in the next room, but he wouldn't stay there for long. He would try to reposition, find an angle. Behind her, the scarred man shifted slightly. She didn't even need to look. She knew what he was thinking. "Don't," she warned, her voice like steel. He stiffened, his hands still raised. The nervous guy was already out of the fight, clutching his injured wrist and barely holding himself together. Another sound. The leader moving again. She pressed her back against the wall, then inched toward the doorway. The hallway was narrow, only a few feet wide. He was trying to bait her out, force her into the open. She wouldn't play his game. Instead, she reached for the scarred man's belt, yanking the knife from its sheath. In one fluid motion, she hurled it toward the kitchen, where it clattered against metal. A deliberate distraction. The leader took the bait. He fired toward the noise, giving her the opening she needed. She pivoted into the hall, gun raised. He saw her a second too late. Her shot hit him square in the shoulder. He grunted, stumbling back, his gun clattering to the floor. She was on him in an instant, kicking the weapon out of reach and slamming him against the wall. He tried to resist, but she twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him down. He growled in frustration, struggling, but she was stronger. "Who are you?" he gasped, his breath ragged. She leaned in close, her voice deadly calm. "The last mistake you'll ever make." His eyes widened. Realization. Regret. She pressed the gun to his temple. And then sirens. A faint wail in the distance, growing louder. The authorities were closing in. The scarred man let out a shaky breath. The nervous guy was practically whimpering. The leader clenched his jaw, knowing his time was up. She stepped back, lowering her weapon slightly. The job was done. They weren't a threat anymore. Minutes later, flashing lights bathed the cabin in red and blue. Officers stormed inside, weapons drawn. She lifted her hands, showing she wasn't a threat. One of the agents recognized her immediately, eyes widening in shock. "Stand down," he ordered the others. "She's one of ours." The officers hesitated, then holstered their weapons. She turned and looked at the 3 men who had taken her. They were being dragged to their feet, cuffed, their faces a mix of shock and defeat. The leader met her gaze one last time, his expression unreadable. She held his stare, then spoke, her voice cold and unforgiving. "You picked the wrong woman." And with that, she walked past them, out into the night, leaving them to face the consequences of their choices. She never looked back.